G'day mate, 40 here. So there's been a lot of discussion about did the assassination attempt on Donald Trump come from violent rhetoric on the part of the Democrats. Exhibit 1, that recent New Republic cover story showing Donald Trump as Hitler. 2, President Joe Biden saying he was going to put the bullseye on Donald Trump. And the Democrats' number one argument against Donald Trump is that he's a threat to democracy, and this could be the last election if Donald Trump gets voted in. And Dennis Prager wrote a column today that democratic rhetorical violence made this assassination attempt on Donald Trump inevitable. And I agree with the Reason magazine crowd that we should not primarily blame violent rhetoric for this shooting. We should blame the shooter. And you're inevitably going to have incendiary political speech when you have free speech, right? When people are fighting for their different versions of what's good and evil in a diverse society, right? If we were a more homogeneous society, a more united society, right, we wouldn't see good and evil in such hyperbolic terms. We would have more common values. But because we prize diversity, we prize having less and less in common with our fellow citizens. When we have less and less in common with our fellow citizens, we're more likely to see our fellow citizens as a grave and present danger. So you have reduced social cohesion and social trust. And then combine that with different visions of the path ahead for our country. And you have all these incentives for incendiary rhetoric that you don't have in a more homogeneous society such as Japan. And Japan has nothing like our rhetorically violent talk shows. Right? Japan, back in the 1980s and 90s, had nothing like the McLaughlin Group and does not have anything like the old McLaughlin Group today. Right? Because the Japanese largely agree on political matters, and that's what you generally get when you have a homogeneous society. Prices of diversity is low social cohesion, social trust, and not much agreement on the path ahead. But no, I don't blame Democrats' rhetoric as the primary factor. On the other hand, the logical extension of saying that this will be the last election if you vote for Donald Trump, logical extension of that Trump is Hitler, then you are saying it is morally right to kill Donald Trump. Just as if you claim that abortion is murder, then you are simultaneously claiming the moral thing to do is to kill people who provide abortions. If you say the election in 2020 was fixed, then you're releasing people from any moral obligations. So when you engage in rhetoric that enables people who agree with you to feel released from any moral obligations, then you are contributing to a more dangerous situation. But that rhetoric, I don't believe, should be primarily given the blame for an assassination or for January 6th, right? Donald Trump laid the groundworks for January 6th, but he was not primarily responsible. It was the lawbreakers themselves who were primarily responsible for their own excesses on January 6th. But Donald Trump's rhetoric played a significant role. So you'll see with our dominant elites that they engage in something that Alvin Gouldner called careful and critical discourse, right? There's a repression of our natural rhetorical and verbal instincts by our elite. They want to engage in careful and critical discourse. And so that's part of the reason that the news media was highly reluctant to call the shooting of Donald Trump on Saturday an assassination until you had law enforcement come out, hold a press conference, and announce that they were treating the situation as an assassination attempt. So this is elite discourse, right? Wait for the proper bureaucratic procedures and the proper bureaucratic agencies to issue a ruling. Only when you get that ruling from the proper bureaucratic agencies and the proper bureaucratic protocols are followed, right? When you have that proper structure abided by, then you follow their guidance, as opposed to the wisdom, the common sense of ordinary people who, for example, have some familiarity with high-powered rifles, right? If you have some familiarity with high-powered rifles and you heard the pops and you saw Donald Trump go down and then come up with blood flowing from his ear, right? Your common sense suggests to you that this was an assassination attempt. So common sense has suggested to people since 2018 that Joe Biden is obviously senile. But our dominant elite, engaged in their careful and critical discourse, said, well, what medical doctors who've examined him and who've had access to his medical records, are thoroughly familiar with his health, have made a pronouncement that he's suffering from cognitive decline. Unless the proper bureaucratic procedures are followed, proper protocols are followed, and the proper people with expertise are listened to. Until that happens, well, I'm not a doctor. I can't say Joe Biden has cognitive decline. Well, your ordinary person's gut and your ordinary conservative's common sense says, yeah, obviously Joe Biden is suffering from cognitive decline. We don't need no stinking doctor to issue a report. G'day, Josh Randall. Yeah, LA has something of a sidewalk problem. Look at these beautiful jacaranda trees, right? The college yearbook at Avondale College, where I grew up in Australia, was called the Jacaranda, because we had so many of them where I grew up in Currumbong. So careful, critical discourse, right? We have to be very careful with our language. That's something that marks you off as a member of the elite, someone who's graduated from Harvard. You don't rush to judgment saying things like assassination, or you certainly don't call someone senile. Right? You take a pause and you use very careful language, and you wait for those with expertise to issue their rulings. And sometimes the experts are right, and sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes common sense is right. So people with common sense and familiarity with a high-power rifle, right? They knew what was happening within 10 seconds of those shots ringing out. Now, what also goes along with careful critical discourse is a careful approach to life, emphasizing safety and health and care and minimizing harm. And there are many areas where this approach is superior to the more rough and ready, ornery, individualist American approach to life. I'm just going to get out there and live, and I'm not going to be held back by all these considerations of care and minimizing harm. Right? You're robbing life of its vitality. And so the director of the US Secret Service gave an interview yesterday, and she said, we didn't have agents, we didn't have law enforcement on top of that building because the building had a very gentle slope. And we thought that putting an agent on a very gently sloping roof would be too dangerous. And instead, taking good care of their agents, they had 3 members of law enforcement inside the building. Right, so on top of the building, the shooter was getting off 8 shots at President Trump. And the people inside the building, right, were not much help dealing with the shooter on top of the building. Can you believe it? Right. Now, her explanation makes no sense, because the 2 counter-sniper teams that they did deploy were on buildings with slopes, right? Sloped roofs. So she says they didn't have any law enforcement on top of the building because its very gentle slope was too dangerous. Right? So when you use language carefully and critically, you also will tend to take a careful and critical approach to life, right? You're not going to be as likely to drive fast and to engage in risky behavior, right, if you're using language carefully and critically. Right? When you walk carefully, you will tend to speak carefully. Right? Everything we do affects us. And so the careful, critical discourse that dominates our elites, you also see it in the decisions. Right? The gently sloped roof was too dangerous to put an agent on top of. Yeah, not feasible to fix all those sidewalks. The only possible feasible solution is some combination of city paying a part and private, the owners of the property up to the sidewalks paying a part. Yeah, roof pitch is the problem. The place is locked down more than any place I have seen at the convention right now. Oh, Moon Man's at the convention. Yeah, well, for good reason. But can you believe the director of the Secret Service says we didn't put agents on that roof because it had this very gentle slope. Right now, if you had a female versus a male director of the US Secret Service, or making a decision whether or not to put agents on that roof, right, do you think that females in charge would be just as likely, more likely, or less likely to put an agent on a gently sloping roof? I don't know what your life experience is, but mine is that women tend to be much more risk averse. And so much more likely to decide, oh, we shouldn't have an agent on a very gentle sloping roof because it's just too risky. And she says, the buck stops with me. She says the buck stops with me, but she's not resigning. I mean, in many cultures, the director of the equivalent of a Secret Service after such a disastrous event would resign quickly. But she defended not putting an agent on the roof because it had a gentle slope. Right? So men and women come with different gifts. Right? Often female caution is warranted. Right? Married men often make safer choices than single men. Single men are often absolutely reckless in the way they go about life. They drive too fast. They eat badly. They take a lot of unnecessary risks. On the other hand, right, there can be a smothering in cotton wool effect sometimes with female leadership and with women, right? There's no coincidence that smother is just mother with an S. And so our careful, critical discourse, our safety first, our protocols of care and concern and harm minimization at the cost of effectiveness and excellence can really take a toll. So I suspect that if a man was making a decision, in this case, he would have been much less reluctant to put an agent on a gently sloping roof. If I were an agent, if I were in security, and I was asked to take up a position on that gently sloping roof, it would not overly bother me, right? I would not refuse to do my job because the roof has a gentle slope to it. Oh, one other thought about the rhetoric. So in life, we don't always get to choose the battleground. So imagine if things were the other way around, that Joe Biden had been grazed by a bullet, and then do you think the same amount of attention would be paid to Republican rhetoric, or 10 times the amount of attention would be paid to Republican rhetoric by the news media? So the news media There's not much concern with violent rhetoric from the Democrats right now, but if it were the other way around, they'd be tremendously concerned. So I don't agree with Republicans tying the shooting of Donald Trump to Democratic rhetoric, if that's their primary area of blame. But Republicans do not operate the machinery of media and culture. Republicans do not operate most of our country's institutions. And so it is the liberals and the leftists who control most of discourse in this country, who control the high ground of culture and media, who control our dominant cultural and media institutions. And so if this were the other way around, right, the media would be 10 times as exercised and direct 10 times as much coverage at Republicans for their violent rhetoric against Joe Biden. They would attribute the shooting to the FJB, F Joe Biden chants. And they would make the argument, well, if you're saying F Joe Biden, you're laying the groundwork for this kind of attack on Joe Biden. So when Republicans meet this challenge by making Democrat-sounding, liberal-sounding arguments that it was violent leftist rhetoric that laid the groundwork for this assassination attempt, I got to have some sympathy with that, because this is the ground that the media has prepared, right? After Gabby Giffords was shot, right, Democrats, leftists in dominant cultural and media and academic positions blamed violent Republican rhetoric, such as Sarah Palin putting a bullseye on Gabby Giffords' congressional seat. So this is the ground that Democrats prepared. So you don't always get to choose the ground on which you fight. So Democrats already prepared this as an area of contest. And so Republicans are rising up and blaming Democratic rhetoric for Trump's assassination as simply acting as Democrats would if it were the other way around. Right? Democrats, the elite on the liberal left, with their care and concern, their careful critical discourse, they would seize on the F Joe Biden chants and tough anti-Joe Biden Republican rhetoric, and they would blame that for any attack on Joe Biden. So it's understandable why conservatives would consider turnaround as fair play, right? You Democrats, you liberal elites did this to Republicans when Gabby Giffords, Democratic Congresswoman, was shot by some madman about 16 years ago. So why should Republicans not respond in kind? It's interesting how many dissident right Twitter accounts J.D. Vance follows. He follows Steve Saylor, Richard Hanania, and about 10 other leading right-wing edgelords. That's pretty cool. It's my mum's birthday tomorrow. Might buy her a crappy card of something. You're a generous man, Josh Randall. So I'm not someone who believes in the reality of racism, but if racism is a dominant concern in the country, right, then it's fair to use it. Right? You have to meet people where they are. And if that's where we're fighting in the country, then Republicans have to be prepared to meet the rhetoric, meet the moral arguments, and apply them to their advantage. So yeah, I would rather we had a country that wasn't concerned with racism and that didn't place an excessive amount of attention on violent political rhetoric, where we blamed shooters for the bad things they're doing rather than political rhetoric, where we didn't take as real moral categories these phony concepts of racism, ageism, ableism, sexism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and the like, right? To me, those are all bogus moral categories. But given that they are the dominant moral categories of our cultural and moral and political discourse, then I can understand why you may want to meet people where they're at, and you have to take up battle, often on the land that the enemy